Welcome to our next video. In this video, we're going to talk about external validity threats. So these would just be different things to kind of watch out for that can influence our ability to generalize our findings to a larger population setting or time. All right, so there we go. So the first external validity threat that we have would be participant selection. So the question that we're asking here is, does the group of participants that we have represent the population at large that we're interested in generalizing to? Now, oftentimes, maybe we are aware of that and we know that we should only be generalizing to a very particular group of the population, right? So as long as that is our defined population of interest, that's fine. But we want to know in what ways that generalization could be problematic to make. So pretty much all these questions that we asked on the at the end of the previous video would apply here. Is, what things did we do? What questions did we ask to kind of ensure that we have appropriate representation? And also, what are just the weaknesses? Because pretty much all the time when we work with people or something like that, there's going to be weaknesses, and we just want to document them well. All right, so the second external validity threat that we have here is setting. So is the setting of our study representative of all settings that we wish to generalize to? And there's several different considerations here. The first is going to be the physical environment. So physically, what space did our study take place in? What places did the people in our study live in during the experiment or study of interest here? So an example I might use is if we're looking at the effect of running, maybe as a treatment factor versus some other exercise, what's the physical environment of the running taking place in? Is it taking place on a treadmill? Is it taking place outdoors? Is it taking place in some other, a certain temperature, season, something like that? Those would all be relevant to understanding limitations of the physical environment and, what we can really generalize to versus what we didn't actually study carefully. The social environment would be another external validity possibility. So, what's the social context for this study? What country or region was involved? What particular doctors or nurses might be involved in this study that might have affected how these results generalize. So these are things that we just want to ask as well. And then context in general. So are there any other contextual factors the study took place within? So there's just kind of some examples here. And a lot of these ideas are going to kind of blend together. These are not meant to be like really clearly separable categories, but they're kind of entry points into the conversation that we want to ask. And I also want to just kind of distinguish here internal versus external threats, because sometimes this can get confusing. So we had a setting threat listed under internal, and we have a setting threat listed under external. So what's the difference? So setting threats for internal validity have to do with confounding between the experimental conditions. So if I have a control group and a treatment group, and those groups are in different spaces or in different social contexts or physical environments or something like that, that can interfere with my internal validity because it's another difference between my experimental settings besides the treatment factor of interest. So any other setting differences besides or unrelated to my treatment factor can confound my comparison. A setting threat for external validity has to do with what is constant about my experimental setting that may not generalize to a larger setting in general. So if all of my participants were doing their study in the same hospital or the same city or the same, with the same group of doctors or something like that, or nurses, would that context generalize to a larger context, a different place, a different set of doctors or nurses, different things like that? So that would be the distinction. Is it confounding the difference between my experimental groups, or is it a commonality of all of my participants that may not generalize to a larger population? All right, and then the third external validity threat that we have in our class is historical sustainability, and that would be related to time. So does the time that my study took place generalize to other possible times? Would I expect to see the same results at different times? And this isn't always going to apply, even though like it may always be a question that I could ask. Most of the time it just won't be relevant. But if I'm doing something that is a time-sensitive experiment or something, maybe it's culturally related, as we'll see an example coming up. But am I studying something such that the nature of it will change over time, over the years? Or is it related to, again, is it a seasonal thing where the fact that I'm studying in the winter, when would I necessarily see the same results in the summer? So again, just distinguishing this from internal versus external. Internal is differences in timing between my groups. External is a commonality of my groups or the people in my study that may not be shared by a larger population. So if my entire study took place during the winter, would I expect to see the same results if I repeated this experiment during the summer? That would be an external validity threat. However, I have one group who does their experimental setting in October and one that does their experimental setting in January. Does that difference confound the comparison of my groups? That would be an internal validity threat. All right, so here's just a graphic that kind of distinguishes the two again. Just this idea of internal is within the experiment itself, anything else confounding my comparison between groups. External is based on what I found here in this study. Can I generalize these results to a larger population, setting, or time? So I challenge you to, in your own words, try to describe the difference. I think that would be a good challenge for you to see if you really get it. And if not, you can always talk to me. But yeah, see if you can, in your own words, try to write out what the differences between internal and external validity and what they're concerned with. All right, so let's do a practice problem together. So researchers in 1985 studied whether the program one watches on TV before bed may assist someone in falling asleep faster. Randomly selected landline phones in America's top 10 most populated cities were called, and callers asked to speak to heads of household. The researchers concluded that people who watched the news were more likely to fall asleep faster than those watching any other TV platform. What might be some threats to the external validity of this study? So in other words, I have a claim, I have a result from this study. Would I expect that claim to hold with other people, in other settings, and other times? So let's go through these one by one. A participant selection threat. Is there any threat to who is involved in this study and whether or not they would represent a larger population? So if my goal is to generalize to US Americans, which it's not clear, maybe it should say that if that's the goal here, but if I were to assume that, then I'm going to have a qualm here with the fact that these are all people in the 10 most populated cities. So those people may not have the same characteristics as people who live in smaller cities or towns or things like that. So the first thing that I'm going to mention here is, city people, especially kind of these like big urban cities, may not represent non-city people. So I should be very careful who my population of interest is. Is it US Americans or is it only people who live in big cities? Because I think this sample probably better represents the second of those two things. The other thing that you may not have caught, but that I would point out is this term heads of household. This is actually a very common term that's being phased out of polling. I don't think pollsters really use this anymore, but back even when I was, I used to work at a polling center for about a year. And even that was when I was, 21, 22. And I remember they still had this term on one or two of their surveys. It was a little bit outdated. This typically means that if there's more than one person in the house, most people interpret this as the oldest male member of the house, or just the oldest member. So this can influence who's actually answering these calls. So if you're calling a lot of heterosexual married couples, you're probably getting a lot of men. more so than you are women in a lot of these cases if you're using this term. So I would say this may overrepresent older men. So that should be taken into consideration here. Now, the setting threat, this is going to overlap a little bit, but I would again point out the city thing because I think that is introducing something here. Because if we're talking about the news as one option, the type of news that you have in these largest cities might be qualitatively different than the type of news programming in smaller cities or towns. So I'm just going to mention that here. Cities again. Nature of news programming. I think that would be relevant to point out here. I don't know if there's any other clear setting threats that I would mention here, other than just, like the fact that there might be other characteristics about living in a city that influence, the nature of TV watching. Are people watching more late night TV, things like that? But that's probably getting a little bit too deep into this. And then third, for historical sustainability, is there any reason to think that the results of this study may not generalize to other times? And every time that we're talking about something that's kind of culturally related, something that involves something that changes over time, TV programming would definitely fit that description. If we're talking about the nature of TV programming in 1985, I would argue that that's probably not the same as TV programming today. Even just the nature of what people watch has changed. And certainly the nature of news programming, I would argue, has changed a lot since 1985. The result of this study is that news programming seems to be what people are most likely to fall asleep watching. I don't know if that's still true anymore. I think that is something that threatens the result is, in this current year, would this still be true? Because the nature of news programming has probably changed. All right, so I hope that was kind of a helpful way to dig into that and think through how we identify types of external validity threats with a kind of a realistic example there. Yeah, so I guess that's actually all that I have for this video.